All right, we'll get started here. I want to welcome you to our webinar today, and the topic for discussion is replenishment in NCR Counterpoint. And today we're going to be leading the webinar. It's myself, Andy Smith, and my colleague Nell Thompson, who is Senior Project Manager for the implementation and training team. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping first. If you have questions in the Zoom, there's the opportunity to pull down the Q&A and send a message by text. Feel free to do that at any time. We'll be looking at the questions as we go, and if there is a reason to address it right away, of course we will answer your question real time, but at the end we'll also take some time to answer any questions that have come in. Also, there'll be a recording of this webinar available. It'll be posted on all of our websites, including Counterpoint University, which is our training website, along with all the webinars that we have done over the last few months. This is about the 7th, I think, webinar that we have conducted on different topics of Counterpoint. And this is one that we're excited about because it's something that many of our users have asked for. So just to talk about what we're going to cover, we're going to really focus in on replenishment, and this is a term of art. Certainly replenishment in our system is understanding what you have and having the system recommend what to get. The concept of replenishment is the same as restocking or, supply chain management, just-in-time inventory management, all kinds of terms that people use for it, but generally, we're calling it a restocking or replenishment. Now, it's a little confusing because there's a report in Counterpoint called Purchasing Advice. It's something we're going to be talking a lot about during this webinar. And one of the versions of Purchasing Advice is called replenishment. So just want to be clear, the concept of replenishment is the bigger picture of things, but when we get to talking about that report, replenishment is just one of the methods of measuring. So we're going to talk about some foundational terminology, just like I did there, but clarify some key things about your inventory. And then really replenishment is 3 steps. It's knowing what you have, it's kind of having the system recommend what you need, and then going forward and placing orders for those things. We're going to talk about the first 2 key parts of that, the knowing what you have and figuring out what you need in the system, and then also look at a couple of other cases, unique capabilities in the system that are very similar to the primary function of replenishment. As mentioned, we'll end with a question and answer and follow up with next steps. So that concept of replenishment is what we're talking about here. The idea of replenishment says you start off by identifying what you have, and that's really reporting and business information. It's mining information that's currently in your system and presenting it in a way that you can understand what your current status is. The next step, of course, and this is the key part of replenishment, is having the system do analysis of your data to figure out what do you need to buy, who should you buy it from, and how much should you buy. Of course, the final step is issuing purchase requests or purchase orders or going online and placing orders with your suppliers. And we'll talk about those various things as we go through here today. So let's start with some inventory concepts. I'm showing a view within your system. It's found in the inventory section of Counterpoint, and it's inventory detail view. And what I like about this is I can organize the columns in that view for certain things, and I've just taken a cut and paste of an inventory view here for reference. And I'm only showing 3 items just to keep it really simple. And this is demo data, so it's not intended to be as accurate as if you were to run these reports in your own store with live inventory, live vendor connections. But I think it's good from an example perspective. Of course, I'm doing the demos. We're going to run this in as my garden center demo, but it applies to every industry, every vertical that we support. So in this inventory view, it's basically showing a lot of important data about your items. And I like inventory view. If you watched our reports webinar, it is very flexible. I can kind of put these columns in whatever order I want and see things in a structure and order that makes sense for me. In this case, I'm looking at item and description where all for one location, but I'm looking at my minimum, maximum quantity, and available quantity on hand, committed, and order. We'll talk about each of those in a second. First, let's focus in on MinMax. So this is, you have the ability to set for any item in your inventory a minimum and maximum stocking level. So when we start to talk about replenishment, the very fundamental idea is that I want to say I never want to have fewer than X, and I never want to have more than Y in my store. We'll talk specifically about how we go in and set these minimum maximums, and also how the system can recommend what those should be in just a few seconds. The next thing you're going to see are kind of our inventory numbers. What's the quantity available of those, separate from what's available, what's on hand, and then also what's committed. These are three unique numbers in the system, and it's really important to understand the difference. If you deal with orders, layaways, the concept of committed inventory is complicated but very important for tracking accurate inventory. Available is what you have that's available to sell right now, meaning it's not committed to anyone else. Your on-hand inventory would be if you were to go in and count everything in your store, that's what you would have today. And the difference between those two is your committed inventory. It's inventory that's already allocated to a customer transaction. For example, an order or a layaway or back order. So the system's accounting for those. When we talk about your available, or we talk about replenishment, I'm sorry. When we talk about replenishment, available quantity is going to be the key, and also you can refer to it as net quantity. So available quantity is without factoring in any pending purchase orders or things that are in the pipeline already ordered but not come in. Net quantity would factor in things that are on purchase order already. That concept of committed inventory, as I said, it's going to be all of the things that are unposted, pending orders, layaway, special orders, back orders, and the formula is in Counterpoint on hand minus committed equals available. So let's talk about setting your min-maxes. There's two places in Counterpoint where you can find and change your min-maxes item by item. So in the primary inventory section, go to your items record, and within the items record on the very lower left-hand corner, there is a button called inventory. And when you open it up, you'll be able to see your inventory location by location, and each one of those will have the min-max setting. And you can have a different min-max for each location where you stock that item. Another place to find this same information is in the item section or the inventory section of Counterpoint. Go to the inventory function button and it'll just open up that screen on its own. And you can go item by item and see the numbers for each location for that item. Notice that you also see other really good relevant data about this item when you're setting your min-maxes. When you're looking at this inventory tab, you can see things like your committed, what's currently available, what's on POs, on order, on back order, on special order, or layaway. So again, just presenting a lot of useful information to you right there. I want to jump over to Counterpoint for a second and kind of show you this in operation. I've just opened up my inventory number and kind of included it here. As I said, you can have the system, if you had multiple inventory locations, you can have a different min-max. But to change this, I can just come in and change the number and hit save, and it would update this number in real time. Now, this is tedious work to go in and item by item set up your min-maxes. And so there's a very useful tool in the system called a MinMax advice report. It's in inventory, it's in reports. It's right down here on the bottom, MinMax advice report. What this is doing is it's a way to have the system recommend what your min-max level should be. And in order to do that, number one, we're defining the location that it's looking in. So I'm going to actually do this just for my main store. I'm going to also set a period of time. This is a measurement period. And you'll hear us talk throughout the rest of this webinar today about this concept of measurement period. It's basically saying, focus a magnifying glass on a specific period of time and look at my sales or activity in that period of time. So in my recommendation here, I'm going to actually look back and say, you know, let's say year to date as my measurement period. So it's going to look back at my sales from January 1st until today, and then based on that, recommend a minimum that's equal to, say, 5 days of supply, and recommend a maximum that's equivalent to, say, 31 days of supply. System can factor in vendor lead time if you're tracking that on your purchase orders. But in this case, I'm just going to preview this information, and it's going to tell me for each item my current MinMax, or the existing one, and what it recommends me changing it to. Now, there's a lot of noise in my demo system. Some of these items are set up as decimals, so I can sell into the decimal, and that's why these numbers aren't whole numbers. In your inventory, most of these are going to be set up as single units, and you're not going to be able to do fractions. Just another point, this is just a recommendation. You can review it, you can print it up, make changes to it, you can go in and manually fix the ones that need to be edited. But if you bought into what that recommendation was doing, you could just hit apply, and it would push all of those min-maxes and update them into your system immediately. It's a quick, easy way to do that. Now, it's worth pointing out, there's times you might want to do this, for example, for a business that's very seasonal. It might be that you run a different min-max for when you're in season versus when you're out of season. You know, some of our sporting goods stores may do a really big hunting season in the fall. And so if that's the case, you may have different quantities that you want to maintain, different min-maxes. And your comparison period might be last fall. Could even be 2 falls ago if that was a more accurate, typical experience for you. So again, very flexible to you know, focus the magnifying glass wherever it's best for you as you're establishing those min-maxes. Another point in this MinMax advice report, you don't have to run it for everything in your store. On the item tab, I can filter out a particular category or subcategory, or only things from one specific vendor. So the idea is that it's very flexible to kind of hone in on just the things you want to be getting recommendations on. I'm going to bounce back over to our slideshow. We're going to take you on to the next concept here.
All right. And so our key recommendation tool for quantities is going to be purchasing advice. And we are going to find that within the purchasing folder and the purchase request subfolder. What you'll notice here is when we do open up that purchasing advice window, we've got 3 methodologies or approaches that Counterpoint allows us to use. One is maximum, the other one is replenishment, and days of supply. So we're going to take a closer look at each one of these in just a second here. All right, and now this is just an overview summary chart. We are going to get into a demo and demo each one of these, and you'll see examples, but just to kind of go through the basics of each one, we've got our maximum approach. Now this would be what we would consider a more simple approach, and it is based on the min and max quantities that are set on the items. Okay, you can notice it can be adjusted to what might be out there in terms of purchase requests or orders and that. And ultimately what this maximum approach is going to give you is a suggested quantity. Whenever your current quantity falls below your minimum, and that quantity is going to get you to your maximum level. Okay, with our replenishment and days of supply, these two are more similar to each other than they are different. For replenishment, we'd consider this the most flexible, and this one is based on your sales history. Okay, and a history factor, which we'll get to in a couple minutes here. You'll notice that the replenishment approach can be adjusted for everything that the maximum approach can be adjusted for, but it can also take into account current quantity. And if you've set that min and max quantity, that can be taken into account as well. Now, it is worth noting that both for replenishment and days of supply, you are not required to have a min and max quantity in order to run or use these approaches. And what replenishment gets you is a suggested quantity to stock based on your expected sales. Okay, and just like any of the other approaches, you can set your filter, so you might select one particular category or one particular grouping of items. Now, with days of supply, we consider this best to control that just-in-time purchasing. Okay, and similar to replenishment, it is based on sales history, but it is looking at your average daily sales. Okay, again, it does have options, so you can adjust what Counterpoint suggests as quantities. And again, very similar to replenishment. But what it does is it gives you just the quantity to purchase for a set number of days that you want to keep stock for. And maybe that's because, you know, you have a limited amount of space in the store, or for cost reasons, you might not need to purchase for an entire season at once. Rather, you just want to keep, you know, a 7-day supply and keep repurchasing. All right, and this right here is that purchasing advice window. You'll notice this time around at the top, we are looking at the replenishment approach here. And you'll notice there's 4 different quadrants on this window. So on the left, we've got locations. You know, if you are multi-location, you can run this purchasing advice for all of them. Or if you're a single location, it can be specific to that. Then we've got our report quadrant, and this allows us to show, basically show or decide what detail we want to see on this report. Okay, we can see our vendor list and cost order. We can see different options for our vendors. We'll do all of this and play around with it in our demo. And then on our right, we've got 2 more quadrants here, our adjust suggested quantity for and replenish based on. And both of these quadrants are directly related to the report or the approach that we're using. With the replenishment approach, you'll see more options to adjust suggested quantity. With our days of supply, you are going to see a field there to enter in the days of supply. And again, when we get into the demo, we'll really get a chance to see the specific changes that it brings. Before we do, though, there's just 2 concepts we want to get through, and one of them is that measurement period. So again, because replenishment and days of supply are using sales history, we do set our measurement period for both of these approaches. And the part to remember here is that the period you're selecting is the exact same one you're getting results for. Okay, so if you're looking at your sales from August of 2019 to try to decide what you're purchasing for August of 2020, and your current quantity is 0, right? Sales from August 2019 were 100. The suggested quantity is going to be 100. Okay, unless we do one more thing, which is to adjust our history factor. All right, and what our history factor gives us the chance to do is adjust our suggested quantity based on what we expect our sales are going to do. Okay, if we expect an increase in our sales, we can tell Counterpoint to increase our suggested quantity by that %. And if we're expecting a decrease, then we can have Counterpoint apply logic to decrease our suggested quantity by that percentage. All right, let's jump into the demo. All right, we're going to go right into purchasing here. Purchase requests and purchasing advice. All right, and we are going to keep this just very simple for the first time we run it. You'll notice we're looking at our maximum report up top. We are going to run this for just a single location. We're going to keep our report parameters rather basic, and we're not really adjusting our suggested quantity for anything right now. Okay, and if you could preview that for us, Andy. Okay, and thank you. All right, so you'll notice here that we've got two items that Counterpoint suggests quantities for. One is our garden planter, and it suggests we purchase 9 of them. And we've got our Aisha hydrangea, and Counterpoint suggests we purchase 11 of them. Andy, do you happen to have that inventory detail view up? Oh, perfect. All right, so if we look here, right, we'll notice that our garden planter has a min quantity of 3, a max quantity of 9, but 0 available. Okay, and just to get to our max quantity of 9 from 0, Counterpoint is suggesting we purchase 9 of them. For our Aisha hydrangea, our current quantity available is 4, which is less than our min quantity. Okay, and Counterpoint suggests 11 to get us to our max quantity of 15. Our last item that's on our inventory detail is our brilliant tropical hibiscus. And you'll notice here that our min quantity is 1, but our quantity available is 4. And since our quantity available is greater than our minimum, it does not show up on our maximum report. So just keep in mind that your minimum is that trigger. If your current quantity doesn't drop below that minimum, it is not coming up on this maximum report. All right, and yeah, let's add some more detail to this. So on that report quadrant, we'll show all quantities, we'll show our vendor list and cost order, and just below that, you've got vendor. And right now we have it set to lowest cost vendor. You could set it to primary vendor or specific vendor. Keep in mind though, if you do choose primary vendor, you do want to have a primary vendor assigned to the item, or that item is just not going to show up on the report. If we look on the right, before we do that, we do also have the option to adjust quantity or have Counterpoint adjust its quantity for any purchase requests we have or open purchase orders, or if you're using vendor minimums. Keep in mind though, if you're not doing purchase requests and purchase orders in Counterpoint and maybe purchasing directly from a vendor, Counterpoint doesn't have this information to keep and take into account. So you might have to do that manually as you look at suggested quantities for Counterpoint.
Yeah, I think it's a good point now that, you know, many of our end users of Counterpoint as a habit do not do purchase orders. And this is an area where if you start to follow that discipline of doing purchase orders, your replenishment recommendations that come from purchasing advice are going to be much more accurate, because it's going to help you avoid ordering the same thing twice.
Exactly. And just as Andy showed with the Min and Max advice, you can also filter this by a category or you're okay.
I got ahead of myself, sorry.
You can also filter it by category or by the status of an item, or, you know, another filter that you want to set. All right, we are ready to preview now. Okay. And here, you know, you'll notice that we have a lot more data that we're looking at. Okay, we've got our min-max quantity, our quantity on hand, quantity committed, quantity available, net quantity. So we can really start to see where Counterpoint's getting its numbers from. And you'll also see that because we chose to list our vendors in cost order, we do have our vendors listed along with the cost and cost per unit, depending on the purchasing unit. Okay. Call out here, notice on our garden planter, the vendor that Counterpoint selected was Acme. Okay, and if we notice in our vendor list, Acme has essentially the same cost as the other vendors. When Counterpoint doesn't go with our primary, it is going to do our most recent vendor, and that is why it chose Acme here. And Counterpoint does also call out our primary vendor on here. You'll notice that with just that asterisk next to each one. All right.
Want me to pick up from here?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, let's look at some of the other formats of this report. But before we do, when we ran this report and you previewed it, the idea is that if you are doing purchase requests from this report, you can actually generate purchase requests right within the system. Hit the generate, and it would actually go in and create that draft version of your purchase order. Remember, purchase request is an unposted document. When you post it, it turns into a purchase order in our system. That's perfect because you can have the system create the draft version of that PO very easily. It's going to default to the vendor that it's selected on the report, but it would give you the opportunity before posting to change the vendor and change the quantities. That's going to be true for all of these versions of this report, that you can easily convert the report into a purchase request. Now, if you don't do purchase requests, purchase orders in your system, that's fine. It's still going to be very useful. Just print up the report, go online, and place that order with your supplier. Let's look at the other two methodologies. And so when I changed this from maximum to replenishment, and remember, replenishment in this concept is just the term that NCR uses for this version of purchasing advice. I kind of call it the algorithm that it applies, or the logic that it applies to recommend how many to get, you know. In this particular case, it's a really simple process. We're looking at a snapshot of time, and that's where we set that time frame here. So it says, look at your sales of these items over a specified period of time. Based on that and a history factor, just like Nell mentioned before, tell me what you expect to sell in the future for that same period of time. So if I select a 6-month period here, it's going to give me reporting on the the resulting report. It's going to give me recommendations for what I expect to sell over the next 6 months. Now, layer on top of that, though, all of these abilities to adjust that recommendation. And we're adjusting it kind of as a normal course based on the current quantity. So we assume that you want to sell through your existing inventory as well. So you're not going to order double what you, or things that you already have. Also, I can tell it to factor in MinMax and use those numbers to, so in other words, if it says I'm going to purchase in the, or if it expects me to sell 30 of these, but my max is 20, it's not going to order more than 20. We'll run some examples of this. Let's simplify again so we see kind of the basic report. We're still defaulting to the same lowest cost vendor. We're still doing this for 1 unit. And for my period, again, let's just look at, I'll do year to date. Again, in my demo, there aren't a lot of sales, so in order to get meaningful results, I have to use a longer period of time. But in your store, this is going to be tied right back to the logical season for selling this item. So, for garden center, this was a plant item that you sell primarily in the spring. Your measurement period might be for doing a replenishment right now, because you're in the summer months where it may not be selling as much. Your measurement might have been last summer. So that's the snapshot you're taking. Let's also assume my history factor. So I'm going to do 50% more business. So I'm adding 0.5. You could have made this, 0.5 and done half as much business as you did last year. So it's giving you flexibility to define the focus the magnifying glass on what you want to look at, and then adjust it for your prediction. This is stating fact. It's measuring exactly what happened. This is your crystal ball that's saying, I think I'm going to do more or less this year. Let's preview this report now and see what's different about it. So in this case, we actually aren't seeing the same
Andy,
number of things. Yes?
would you zoom in for me, please?
Thank you. Nell has to remind me to do that because I always forget. In this particular report, there's fewer items on it. It's just recommending buying the hydrangea, not the planter. And the reason for that is my sales for that planter were not high enough to trigger the min. Was my minimum currently was enough. I didn't need to buy any more of them. So this is a very, very useful report, and it gives you a lot of control over what's factored into what you replenish or not. Replenishment is not a science, it's an art. And so The more pivots and options I can select, the more accurate that number or prediction is going to be for you. So in this case, it's telling me the same I need to buy those 11, but it's not letting me go over my my maximum. Watch what happens if I disregard the maximum number. So if I take off max and run the report again, it's still going to filter out anything where I'm below, but now the quantity on this is much higher. So it's actually telling me to order more because it's not capped by the maximum that I set. When you're playing with these, when you're experimenting with this, I encourage you to play around with the numbers and the measures and the periods, see the results. You know your inventory better than anyone does. And so running this report, seeing the status of things and seeing what's recommended, you'll have a pretty good gut feel for whether this makes sense or it doesn't make sense. If it doesn't, there's good reasons for it, and maybe it is that you're not factoring in some of the elements here. Let's do the last one. I'm just going to change this to days of supply. And when I do, you'll see that some of those filters that can be adjustments have gone away. MinMax and actually remember what that was. I apologize. Quantity. Yeah, current quantity, MinMax, none of that matters anymore because all you're focusing on, it's going to automatically factor in current quantity, but the other ones it's irrelevant to MinMax. In other words, if the system knows I need 5 of them, it doesn't matter if it's still above the min, it's still going to recommend that I need 5. So we're using the same concept of a snapshot and a history factor. So this is telling us how do we base our calculation of future sales. And then once I know my future sales, remember this was for, from 6.5 month period. So it's predicting my future sales for the next 6.5 months. But I don't want to order 6.5 months worth of merchandise. I actually want the system to only order me 15 days worth of merchandise. And let's preview this again. And when I run days of supply, you can see here, it's still showing me, it's showing me a different item. All of the ones that were coming up on the replenishment report before based on sales are not really gonna trigger. In this case, it's telling me I only need to order 1 or 2 of these flats of impatience for my future need. Different ways to look at the same problem. And you're seeing different numbers because I'm actually running very different scenarios, even though the number and counts are the same. Finding that right scenario for your particular items is part of the learning how to use this tool. Things that are staples that you use all the time, you might use MinMax for those because those are simple and I just need to know when I'm below my minimum stocking level and order back up to my maximum stocking level. That can be very efficient and easy, but you're going to have some subset of your inventory that is more seasonal and time sensitive. And for you finding the right balance between changing the MinMax numbers dynamically with that MinMax advice report or coming in here and changing the measurement period and history factor are going to give you better and more accurate results. We talked about this converting into a purchase request and letting you then execute on that purchase request. There's actually another tool I want to mention. This is kind of a little side trip away from that purchasing advice tool. We're going to go right into the purchase request tool. And if you are doing purchase orders or if you're thinking about doing them, every purchase order starts as a purchase request and then it's posted and that's what generates the PO. When I create a purchase request though, I'll choose a vendor. And I'm just going to put on Camptown Gardens as my vendor. And if I come to the place where I would start to add my goods, just like in a receiver, you're going to add the goods and services that you want, or the goods that you want to purchase from the supplier. In addition to the normal just searching for an item, creating an item on the fly, I have a new button on here called Add Items. What this does is it launches a little tool that actually runs a replenishment report for me. You'll start to see things that are very familiar from that purchase advice. Over here, I can suggest the calculation of like a recommended amount based on the maximum, the replenishment, the days of supply. It's the same functionality and logic of your purchasing advice. The only difference is we're focusing this on one specific vendor, and you can actually narrow it down even further to say only do it for items where this vendor is the primary vendor. But if you've ever purchased this item from this vendor, it's going to come up as a possible thing for you to consider. I can adjust for vendor minimums and also, focus even in on customer orders on this. But in this case, I'm just going to run it, and I'll run it. Let's do it based on the max. We don't have to factor anything in. Let's just hit next. And next takes you to the next tab, which is the select items. And you'll see I don't have many items that I buy from them that I need right now, so it's only suggesting one item, just like it did on that purchase advice. Of course, now it's defaulting to Camtown Gardens because I started with the assumption that I'm doing this with Camtown Gardens. In this tool, if I wanted to buy the suggested quantity, I just hit suggested quantity, add lines, and close, and now I'm back in my tool. My normal purchase request, and I'm ready to issue the purchase order. If you're using this add lines, and you again, just like you can play around with different algorithms, I could do this with none. For example, it's not suggesting any quantities, and when I hit next, it's just going to show all the things I've typically ordered from this particular vendor, and there's nothing suggested, as you can see. So it's a feature you can turn on and turn off, but just to corral all the things you normally buy from them and quickly add the 12 that you want to put on this purchase order, you can come in and change the quantities. So it's very easy to do that. That's a tool I think a lot of our users don't take advantage of because they're not doing POs as often as they might. But it takes some of the intimidation and it makes doing POs a lot easier. Last thing I'm going to talk about, again, very similar to this concept of replenishment, knowing what you have, knowing what you need, and having the system recommend what to get. Many of our stores do customer-specific purchases. Typically, we're ringing those up as special orders. Sometimes you might ring them up as orders, but there's a report in this same section, in the purchase request section, that will tell you all of your pending customer-specific orders. And what I like with this report, we can do it for single location. We can include detail, but if I come to this, I could focus it in on a specific customer or a specific type. And so in this case, I'm only focusing on my special order lines. So anything that I rang up in that purple special order line, this is something I normally don't carry in my store, and I need to go place an order for it. I can just generate this or preview it. I'm going to preview it, and I'll blow up that form for you so you can see it. In this case, it's actually got 2 orders pending. One is a special order for this item, 1 quantity, and one is a special order for this, 250 of those I need to order. So this idea of special order, a quick, easy way to see what customer-specific things you have to get. And then, again, when I generate this, it will create purchase orders for these items. In this particular format, this customer-specific purchases report only generates with a recommendation of your primary vendor. It doesn't do the lowest cost vendor analysis. It does it with your primary vendor. So if you don't have a primary vendor set for that item, it will not appear in a purchase request. It's actually going to give you a little pop-up error message saying you don't have a purchase primary vendor set for that item. But if you do, it'll automatically create that draft. You can still go into the purchase request and change the vendor to a lower cost vendor. That's perfectly fine. But one of the advantages of using this to set up that purchase order is when you then eventually receive this item into inventory, there's actually a flag on it in Counterpoint. So as you go to receive it, it has a little notation on it that this was for a customer-specific purchase. Is actually going to let you know as you're receiving it not to put it on the sales floor, that this was actually purchased specifically for a customer request. And again, very useful, especially if there's a disconnect between the people doing the receiving and the people managing those customer orders, which is fairly common. Note that when you do this, you can actually have the system do a separate PO per customer, so you can break it out and have an individual PO, or you can have it combined all together into single purchase orders per vendor. I recognize these are really advanced features in Counterpoint, and are things that are, for many of you, may not be functions that you're using today. And I want you to just feel comfortable going in and experimenting with it. These are, the best way to learn is to play around with it, see the results that come up from those purchase request reports, see if it makes sense to you. See if you were just going through your store and ordering the way you always do, would you be making the same choices? How are they different and why? That kind of experimentation with the system will actually make these functions work a lot better for you and help you really understand the translation of reports, recommendations into action of what to buy. I remind you that we have questions available. There's a questions portal, so if you have questions, please feel free to chat and ask some. So far, we have not received any questions, and that's totally okay. That just means we did an amazing job presenting this material. What I'll mention while just checking to see if anybody has questions is that these are very unique store by store. Every store has its own seasonality. It has groups of inventory that you may want to block out and do one type of replenishment for, has other types of inventory that you may not block out. There's all kinds of reasons why your unique situation suggests doing one thing or another. And so doing this alone is not something you're expected to do. We're teaching you the fundamental skills here, but if you wanted one-on-one support or training in this, certainly available and often recommended, to help us make your replenishment even more functional. Haven't gotten any questions, so I'm going to assume that they are not. One thing I will mention, it's the question I was anticipating that didn't get, is that if you are using our system, the reporting, including this purchase advice, is a Crystal report. Crystal Reports has an add-on that allows reports to automatically be generated and distributed. So you could conceivably, with that add-on, have a replenishment report. Let's say the purchase advice report is MinMax, the maximum version, run automatically every Friday if you wanted to, and then it just sits and gets deposited into your inbox. So that's something you're interested in. We absolutely would be happy to talk with you about those capabilities. Haven't heard any more questions, so I'm going to move on to our next steps. Nell, you want to take it?
Sure. All right, so our next steps are going to be rewatching the recording for this webinar. We've got one on managing inventory and advanced reporting. All of that's really going to help reinforce your skills, knowledge, just about inventory in terms of reporting on it and knowing what you're looking at. Next would be to jump in, start putting in some MinMax and MinMax stocking levels and use purchasing advice, see what works best for you and what most closely aligns with the way that you want to stock inventory in your store. Remember, you can save any filters, parameters, remember to favorite your favorite reports, just so it makes this whole process a whole lot easier to return back to. And consider if you're ready to take purchasing to the next level. Email us at rapidcares@rapidpos.com if you're interested in one-on-one training and really getting focused on unique scenarios that you experience at your store with the items that you're selling.
Yeah, I agree, Nell. And one of the things that our president Bart had recommended is when you're kind of just jumping in to try MinMax, you might only identify a small number of items in your store that you want to explore that with, and find a way to segregate those 10 items in your inventory. Different approaches for doing that, but you can play around with MinMax and purchasing advice just for that narrow set and see how it works for you, and then over time expand. So you can put your toe into the water little by little, and eventually really expand the usefulness and utility of the system. I want to thank everybody for coming today, and as I mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out a link to access this recording. We'll make that also available on our site, and the website for all of our recordings is counterpointuniversity.com. That website has all of the webinars we've been doing over the last few months. We'll be doing another webinar next month. We're still trying to decide on the topic, so we are always welcome to hearing your feedback on topics that you think would be really useful to you and beneficial to you, and expand your, the value that Counterpoint brings to your business. Appreciate your being customers, and let us know if there's anything we can do to help you. Thank you.